Welcome back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. We are live in Atlanta. We're at the Georgia World Congress. It's all brought to you by our friends at LifeBridge Health Sports Medicine, as well as our friends at Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. Chris Pika joining us here. Luke Jones, of course. You can follow Chris at Blog and Tackle. A big week here for the pro football writers, right, Chris? And you have a big part in that. Obviously, you are a contributor here, and Luke's a member as well, running around and doing all things Ravens and Owings Mills. And I'll give you your spit guard while we get that together for Chris on our Facebook Live and our YouTube WNST. We're making it up as we go along.
That's always new.
Ed Reed, a big part of this week. I saw Shireen here, Hall of Famer Shireen. I like to point that out as well.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be talking to a lot of these folks this week, but we haven't had a lot of weeks here in the course of – this is my 26th Super Bowl where there's a Raven that's sort of rubber stamped. I sort of thought Shannon Sharpe was going to be all in, and Rod Woodson, some other guys, you feel like it's automatic. We knew Ray was automatic. I don't think there's any question about Ed Reed, and I don't know that we felt that at any point during his career, but now that the week is here, it feels as automatic as Ray Lewis, although not as emphatic. But no one's going to sit here and say Ed Reed's not going into the Hall of Fame Saturday. Maybe not spike the ball as much as Ray, but this goes back to who Ed was, right? It was always Ray, and then there was Ed. And they're both going to be rubber stamped first day, first ballot Hall of Famers.
I mean, if you look at Ed Reed, I mean, in any other city, he winds up probably with a statue outside somebody's stadium. Easily. You know, so I don't say he was second fiddle to Ray.
But he was.
They were complementary parts.
It's Scottie Pippen.
Yeah, I could see that. I think
it's
there were more
complementary
parts. A lot of what Ray did to stop the run allowed, and they had to throw the football, and when they threw the football, it was Ed Reed's area, and he came up with a lot of interceptions and a lot of recoveries and a lot of turnovers for the Ravens. So in a large part, they're almost 1 and 1A working together. You know, would one have been as good without the other, you know, having a Hall of Fame career? Both of them helped each other get to Canton, basically.
The fact that he is considered to be such an emphatic lock, and when they announced the finalists, I think it was beginning of January, NFL Network had a panel and had some Hall of Famers on it, some writers who have voted in the past, and it was just a complete no duh. He's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer, and Chris, safeties typically haven't gotten that treatment. In the same way you mentioned Shannon
John
Sharpe.
Lynch is still on the outside and might never get in.
Right. But in the same way you mentioned Shannon Sharpe, and tight end has been historically another position where guys have had to wait. Even some of the best of all time have had to wait for a couple years at the minimum. Ed is not considered that. And I think for me, having grown up watching Ray Lewis and Ed Reed as a Baltimore kid, didn't have the Ravens for years, didn't have a pro football team, NFL team for years, I have a greater appreciation for what Ed Reed was, even more so than I did watching him play, watching the Ravens since then. And that's not to take anything away from the defenses that they've had this past year, number one in total defense. They've had top 5, top 10 caliber defenses pretty much every year since Ed Reed and Ray Lewis rode off into the sunset. But I just spent a few moments watching one of his many highlight videos you can find on YouTube or NFL.com or wherever, and it reminds you how incredible he was anytime he got his hands on the football. And for an organization that we've talked a lot in the last 5 or 6 years about just lacking playmakers on either side of the ball, he was the epitome of a playmaker in that anytime he touched the ball, whether it was the rare occasion he'd go back and return a punt, whether it was blocking a punt, still the best punt blocker I've ever seen at the NFL level in my mind, or an interception, fumble recovery, whatever. He had a chance to take it all the way, and that drove coaches crazy because he would lateral the ball, he would fumble it on occasion.
I remember that, yep.
But he was just, I've said, I mean, Ray Lewis is the face of this franchise through its first 2 decades plus, but Ed Reed, I'll continue to say, is the most exciting player to ever play for the Ravens because of that ability to take it all the way, even if he's 7 yards deep in his own end zone.
Well, I think for me, you know, Ed Reed passes that eye test, okay? You look at a guy, you look at his numbers, the totality of his career, you look at those highlights and see what impact he had. That's the eye test. He passes it on all counts. I would be very surprised if he is discussed in the room more than 10 minutes.
Sure.
I think it's more just a resuscitation of everything he's done, his numbers, and where he is on league lists, and all the stuff that he did for the Ravens and within football. And I don't think there's going to be much discussion beyond that. I don't think there's going to be, if anything, negative about him, as you try to, time against other people in that list. I mean, what people don't understand, the two toughest cuts of the Hall of Fame are the two that are coming up. It's going from 15 to 10 and 10 to 5.
Right.
That's the hardest cuts the entire year. It's easy to have a group of 50. It's easy to have a semifinalist of 25 and then a finalist list of 15. It's those two cuts in the room from 10 to 5.
How many people have gone into the room in the last 20 years and still don't have a plaque?
Plenty.
Well, there are a lot.
And that's really where the rub is do you say, all right, Art Modell, I make that case all the time on a contributor level, and that's fine. How many of these players, the Joe DeLamielleure, these guys that come by year after year and get churned through. I remember Art Monk forever, right, waiting on the outside to get in. And then there's we talk baseball. He and I think you and I talked Messina a little bit last week as well, Chris. We've talked about Messina, Schilling, and now Schilling's still on the outside. Will he get in? We talked about Edgar Martinez all these years. We never talked about Harold Baines. He's in. It's crazy. There was no discussion of him. And
yet, kind of a reason for
and
that.
yet here we are again with Tony Baselli, and here we are with John Lynch, and here we are with, Ty Law, and here we are with Edgerrin James, and these guys. But to me, the real question of Hall of Fame is when there's no argument at all. When there's no argument at all, that's what the Hall of Fame is. At its core, it's Ed Reed. No argument, he's a Hall of Famer. That's when you know it's a Hall of Famer. When you got to sit around for 20 years and debate Phil Niekro, or sit around and debate Phil Rizzuto, or sit around, then maybe it isn't such a good idea.
Well, but that's when you start to debate how exclusive should it be. Yes, we all know Ray Lewis or Ed Reed or Joe Montana. Go down the list of any first ballot, surefire, lock of a lock candidate you can find. There's no nuance to that debate.
Right.
We just spent more time spewing diatribes about Ed Reed's greatness longer than the committee might on Saturday. But I think what's fascinating is to debate those. And you just mentioned Mike Messina is a perfect example, not to take this too far away from football, but as time went on and more advanced statistics became commonplace and more accepted, the better his resume looked. Beyond just saying, okay, he had 270 wins and he only had one 20-win season, never won a Cy Young Award. He was on, I think, 5 All-Star teams. But once you start having those advanced numbers and once you take the time to study, and I think that's why a 5-year waiting period is good. That's why, as much as people debate the 10 years on the ballot thing for baseball or the different criteria that any of the Hall of Fames have, I think there is a place for reflection and debate and trying to figure that out. Now, is it a perfect process? No. And I think to bring it back to the football discussion that makes it more difficult for me, baseball we track, right? We track the percentage of voting. In football, beyond being narrowed down to a semifinalist or a finalist.
Yeah, you hate that the room's private, don't you?
I understand the thought process.
Well, it's convenient for the voters, but I've been one of those guys that said, I'm of the next in line to be the Baltimore guy to present Marshall Yonda 10 years from now or whatever. If that were the case, Garceau has the gig. As long as he has it, fine, but he should be in there fighting for. This isn't a fight with Ed Reed this week for Garceau.
No.
The fight's going to happen when it's Yonda against whomever.
Terrell Suggs, first ballot versus having to wait.
And that'll be interesting,
5 years,
too.
Maybe.
I don't know how valued the Dwight Freeneys and the Terrell Suggses are going to be when that time comes. Who's to say, right? I would just say this. I think for the amount of abuse you take out on social media to take on that gig, for the 50-some-odd people that walk into the room, I have sensitivity to that because I've been here for 26 years watching this and watching what they go through. I think it's a little bit of a thankless gig. And Chris, to speak on behalf of the pro football writers that all you deal with all of them, it is a little bit of a thankless gig to do this. It's splitting the hairs as to who's Ed Reed and who's John Lynch, or who's Kurt Schilling and who's Mike Messina, right?
I wouldn't call it thankless from their standpoint. Most everybody you talk to, the voters that are, and not everybody in the room is a PFWA member. There are several like Garceau that are not.
Sure.
Okay, that are television
guys.
I
didn't know that. Okay.
It depends on the market. There are a lot of them in there, but it's not an entirety because some markets may not have a person.
Sure.
That qualifies under
but
one.
Garceau doesn't have to come out of the room Saturday and say, I voted for or against
Correct.
Ty Law,
Right.
so as to piss off or not crazy, ignorant New England Patriots fans. You know what I mean?
And I'll say this as someone who's in the PFWA and someone who, when I do get to vote for awards at the end of the season, I
take it seriously. I take it seriously as well.
Why shouldn't there be transparency? And look, I understand the thought process on both sides. I have a heck of a lot more respect for the Baseball Writers Association members who release their ballot and show everyone who they voted for.
You know what, man? If they're going to give me a vote, I'm happy to say who I voted for. I mean, I'm not going to hide behind my vote.
But if you're going to
That's
vote
fair.
yes or no on any individual, shouldn't you have the conviction to defend that? I mean,
I voted for Lamar Jackson as MVP this year.
I think the one thing to keep in mind, too, is one, like I said, and the point I was trying to make was most everybody you talk to out of our group considers it an honor to be in the room, and they take it extremely seriously. They want to do a good job. They want to do that. The main difference is the baseball writers do it by a mail ballot that's done back in December. It's a one-shot ballot. The pro football has the cut downs from 50 to 25, from 25 to 15, and then they physically get in the room, which the baseball writers don't do. These guys physically get in the room and they discuss the 15 members of the current group, your senior members, your contributor members, whoever that is on a given year, and they're in there battling it out basically for 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 hours about these guys trying to make those cuts.
I've seen them come out. I saw Peter King one year come running out to pee. And I was in the convention hall working, and I see the writers running out, and they're like, we got to go to the bathroom. We got a 10-minute break. And I'm like, man, it's almost like the smoke coming out of the castle, right, in Vatican City, right?
Yep, and by the way, if you get a chance to see him this week, Joe Horgan, who's run the Hall of Fame and he is the guy for that process. He is retiring in June. This is 42 years and done for Joe, who has shepherded that process from beginning to end.
He was also close to John Stedman. I know.
Yep.
When
his dad was a PR guy in the league with the AFL and the Buffalo Bills. Jack Horgan, one of the PFWA awards named after him. But it's a hard process, and because they take it seriously, yes, you have those discussions. And they talked about Tagliabue a few years ago. What was it? Or it was like over an hour.
Yeah.
That it took 2 years in a row where they really delved down in it. So these guys, this isn't fooling around. They understand.
We built a museum for him.
There are legacies involved. I had someone, the late Dave Goldberg from Associated Press, told me when we were discussing some candidates, some of whom may have had Baltimore ties. He said, what people forget is it's an honor to be in the room in the final 15.
Sure.
There is no slouch for not getting all the way there. The fact that you're in that conversation, in that 15, means you have to be pretty special just to get to that point. But not everybody's going to cross that threshold, and some may never get there, may have to wait for a Veterans Committee or Today's Game Committee or whatever that is, contributors to get those people in. And that's a fascinating part of the process. I'm
on the record to say if Garceau doesn't make it down this week and they let me in the room, I'm voting for Baselli. Baselli's my guy, and I am all for the guys that have their career taken away at that point. I'm not going to argue against Terrell Davis or for or what, but guys that were – because his greatness to me is still in debate as to his real – Tony Baselli was unbelievable and had it kind of taken away with the injury. When that happens, I feel more inclined to make an argument for that player 20 years later as a 50-year-old than I would have maybe as a 30-year-old, understanding having been around those players that have had it taken away. And more than that, in this sport where it can be taken away on a stretcher, and I see Steve Gleason, right? Yep. And I see OJ, and I see the human toll of this, to say Tony Baselli shouldn't have the Hall of Fame taken away from him when he was John Ogden any more than you could say, well, John Ogden could have played 3 more years on his bad foot. Or, watching Peter Boulware run around in a sling for a year, which wouldn't happen anymore. They wouldn't let him play. I mean, I talked to Dr. Craig Bennett this week. We talked about that's my plug for LifeBridge Health Sports Medicine Institute, but they don't let players do that anymore. But they don't say strap it up and go play. The agent, the kid's mother, the kid's wife, his children all say you're not playing, and there's a difference in the game today.
I think it's interesting, and this extends to baseball as well. Mike Messina is a perfect candidate of this. You talk about peak, who Tony Pacelli had a peak where it was he and Jonathan Ogden, 1 and 2 in either order you want to, whatever your personal preference was, Coke or Pepsi, basically,
sure.
Who was the best left tackle in the league at that point. Apologies, Orlando Pace, should throw him in there as well. But
longevity used to be such a key component in being a Hall of Famer.
It should still be important, though. I think it should. And that's not to take away from someone who only played 7, 8, 9 years. But then you had the cases where someone had an incredible peak and then they were mortal for the second half of their career. I think, look at someone like Haloti Ngata, who 6, 7 years into his career when he was still a Raven, you would have said – that's a guy who's probably going to be in the conversation.
Well, it's like Ndamukong Suh right now. Like, what's the next 3 years of his career going to look like? Or what's the next 5 years of Aaron Donald? Like, Aaron Donald plays 3 more years like this, and somehow his knee gets shredded. Is he or isn't he? That's for these people to figure out on Saturday.
But that's the thing.
And that's where you are with Pacelli.
Ngata was an elite defensive tackle in this league for about 5 years or so. And since he's left the Ravens, he's been more of an average player. And I would think at this point, maybe he makes it to that first. He'll make it to that first list when they're down to 50. But I don't know if he's ever going to get beyond that. And that's fine. That's not a knock on him. But in 2010 or 2011, you would have thought, man, this guy's really so that's where I do struggle to some degree. And Terrell Davis might be kind of an extreme example.
Terrell Suggs would be a great example. Rusher. 4 years ago, Terrell Suggs was not a Hall of Famer. The last 3 or 4 years
has, Mike Messina never had for him. Mike Messina never had an extraordinary peak 6 or 7 years, but he was really, really good for 17 or 18 years. I mean, that's just so you always weigh that in football. It's even more nuanced and more complicated because of the violent nature of the game.
Right, and now how the game has changed where the playing careers aren't going to be nearly as long. Running backs, what we talked about earlier, running backs maybe had a 12 or 13-year career. That's not the case anymore.
Now even 10.
Now you're going to have to judge running backs off of a peak 4 or 5 years.
Rookie contract, maybe
the second
first half of a second contract.
And that's going to be tough for the committee coming in a decade. They're going to have to look at those running backs and say, who in that group is a Hall of Famer? That's a tough go. I had 2 guys in New Orleans that waited. Willie Rofe was a tremendous offensive lineman that managed to get in. And I worked with Morton Anderson at the tail end in Atlanta. It was obviously a Saints. The kickers had been woefully underrepresented. Right. But again, how do you take the kickers as opposed to other positions? Where do you see that? And Morton waited his turn, but he was the all-time leading scorer of the league, was a great kicker. And a
guest coming by this week, by the way. He's on the docket this week.
And wound up in a position where his year came up where there was a hole. They said, hey, we need to get another kicker into the hole. And sometimes you never know how the room is going to be on a given day. They may look at it and say, you know what, we got a backup of a bunch of guys at X position, and these guys go to the head of the stack. And I think that's what happened with Willie Rofe, offensive lineman. Hey, this is where these guys can get in. And so it makes it really, really hard. And like I said, that's why I say the committee takes their time.
Well, all these wide receivers coming up with all these gaudy stats. And, did Peyton Manning throw the ball to you if you're Marvin Harrison? Or did, what offense were you in? Right. Anquan Bolden. These guys that were really good players. I mean, But then they're the sort of the rubber stamp guys that I think a lot of Fitzgerald, these guys that are just going to go in, right?
Right. But you look at like the markers, okay? How many times was the guy an All-Pro? Pro Bowl doesn't matter. How many times was the guy an All-Pro? How many times was he?
Pro Bowl doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
What do you mean it didn't matter?
As far as selections.
Why were Luke and I together in the room taking notes on Sunday watching the game?
But you're talking about All-Pro players, Players of the Year, MVPs, all those types of things, all decade players.
100-catch seasons.
Right.
1,300-yard rushing seasons.
You're really cutting groups into smaller and smaller groups just to try to get a peer group together.
Luke is here. Chris Pika is here. We are live at the Georgia World Congress. It is Super Bowl 53. That's L-I-I-I. I'm just learning that. L-I-I-I. We will not lie to you, although that's pretty good next to Tom Brady. It says lie right next to him right there. Where's the cheat part? I'm not sure. All of our coverage brought to you by our friends at LifeBridge Health Sports Medicine Institute, of course, up in Owings Mills. You see Cal Ripken on the signs. You're going to hear more about that. I'm going to pull my LifeBridge hat out here as well. Also brought to you by Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast, and the tasty Kona blend in your cup. Go get some fried chicken. Tell my wife to bring some Western fries down here. We got to find some food around this joint. It's your homeland here, and it's kind of taken over. And we've talked a little bit of Hall of Fame here this week. Luke, around the edges, I've talked about Baselli. Give me some more edge guys here, as well as Edgerrin James while we live on the edge there. I guess that's the debate, right? Like Reed is going in, right?
Tony Gonzalez will be an absolute lock. And again, there's another a position historically that hasn't had first ballot guy. In fact, has there been a first ballot tight end?
Shannon Sharp struggled.
Shannon Sharp, who was
the best,
as much of a lock as you can find as a tight end. He waited a year or two, if I recall.
I don't think Gonzalez is. Yeah,
he's not waiting. Right.
No,
I mean,
but
there's another guy that came to Atlanta and changed it. Added to the narrative of his career.
Oh, sure. I mean, there's those guys who have that second act, that third act. I mean, that's
and he was also one of those few guys, because remember, the tight end position back in the 70s and 80s was purely a blocking position, was not a catch.
If you had, if you caught 55 passes for 700 yards, that was a really big deal.
Right. Shannon Sharp was the opposite. He was a catcher, maybe not necessarily a blocker. Gonzalez was one of the few guys that consistently did both, block and catch, and do it very, very well. And I think that's what set him apart from a lot of these guys was, yes, he caught the ball a lot, but if you needed him to chip an edge guy coming, he'd throw his body in front of a guy, and he was a big dude. He'd take care of the business to help the quarterback. So he wasn't one or the other. He was a hybrid guy, and you're seeing a lot more of that now in the league.
Yeah, you have him. You have Ed Reed. Champ Bailey, I think, is maybe the least of a lock of those three, but I feel like I think if people would say yes or no on him,
Redskins fans would argue yes.
But then beyond that, I think Isaac Bruce is really interesting. You do have a Rams connection.
Great numbers.
Even if it's St. Louis as opposed to Los Angeles, I think that's
I'm
something.
I'm an anti-Isaac Bruce guy for the Hall of Fame.
I think that's something that weighs in the back of the minds of the committee, even if they wouldn't necessarily admit that. I think that's a subconscious kind of thing. But he's certainly someone who has been on that list for a long time.
Right.
Edgerrin James, you mentioned. You go through the list. Richard Seymour, someone who I think probably is there at some point.
And I think a name above there is also an interesting discussion, because there's a lot of fans, a lot of people really believe he deserves to get in with the Super Bowl wins and what he did with the Raiders. Again, hard for coaches, hard for contributors.
Right.
When you start making those cuts and you're saying, where do you value a contributor over a player to get to the top 10? Where do you value them to get to the top 5? That's really, really difficult.
Well, the separation in all of these Hall of Fames as to the value of Gil Brandt versus the value of Tom Flores versus the value of Tony Baselli.
Right. That's why the special committees, I think, are trying to fill in those gaps for the contributors, because I think a lot of those guys do deserve to get in, but it's just a numbers game where it's saying, do we take a contributor over a player? You still have some of that with the coaches, but, Don Coryell and some other guys have been in that process too in recent years.
And now we get to the list of everyone else where I think some of these guys sound better than others. Steve Atwater, Tony Baselli, Don Coryell, Alan Faneca, Steve Hutchinson, Ty Law, John Lynch, Kevin Mawai.
You know what's amazing to me is, give me those names again. Lynch and Hutchinson. No, not Hutchinson and Faneca. Boy, man, I remember those guys coming out in the draft and sitting around with Phil Savage in that era, 96, 7, 8, 9. And the Ravens loved those two guys. Like, absolutely. And that was at a period of time when they were drafting John Ogden and looking to shore up the offensive line, needed a quarterback, but never were really drafting. They were always sort of drafting in a spot where they couldn't get a quarterback, but they could get a Hall of Fame offensive lineman. Those guys were, I remember on draft day thinking, I remember Phil Savage saying that's a Hall of Fame offensive about both of those names. So it's funny that I've been around long enough to hear them now thrown around. The other guy was Mawai. Mawai was another guy that was...
Nobody wanted to go up against him. I mean,
he was filthy.
Yes, that's the perfect word for him. Yeah.
Damani Dawson, and then there was him, right? In the next era of Oh God, you know, I mean, you'd have to ask.
He was in the Dan Dierdorf style of lineman. Okay, you did not want to face him because he would use every trick in the book, and sometimes well over the line to make sure you weren't getting through.
Well, there you go.
Yep.
Well, he was another guy that almost hung on and played a couple of extra years. Hey, by the way, guys that hung on, Ed Reed. Ed Reed wore 2 other jerseys, right? I mean, we always say, well,
but he only did it one season.
Cal Ripken never did that.
Yeah.
And, you know, we go through the people who, I mean, I remember Tony Gwynn almost signed up and played with the Indians. It came very close to happening. And I have the old Joe Namath card with the Rams, right? And, and Franco Harris wearing a Seahawk jersey, right? Ed Reed actually did that.
Johnny Unitas was a Charger.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, some of the circumstances.
Not of his making,
right,
but yeah.
Right.
Well, Terrell Suggs might have to make that decision this year.
Yeah, I always feel with Ed, and he's never said this, and my inkling for that was I think he did want another contract, and Ed,
he made another $5 million or $6 million.
But his 3 or 4 final years with the Ravens, I mean, they did this song and dance every offseason that he
retired.
One side of his mouth, he'd talk about wanting to play and wanting a new contract, and on the other side, he'd talk about wanting to retire, and his neck and shoulder wasn't good, and his hip was not great, and so
his Twitter feed was a roller coaster.
But there was that. I think there was something to the idea of not wanting to be in step with Ray and just riding off into the sunset after winning a Super Bowl. And
that's a part of the narrative. The Ed-Ray relationship is and
it was complicated. I mean, they
still might be.
They had times. They had times where they were very much in step. And
my little brother,
and big brother, and there were other times where I think Ed probably was a little tired of
probably
that.
Chafed of it. Yeah, I mean I
can understand that.
Have you ever seen Ed Reed's speech to the Miami Hurricanes?
Oh, halftime?
No. In the meeting room. There's a video of Ed in the Miami meeting room speaking to the Miami Hurricanes as a veteran. This is in the last 10 years.
Okay.
This is sometime.
See, I'm thinking of the halftime where he says, "Don't ask me if I'm okay. I'm hurting, dog."
No.
That one is legendary.
This is Ed going back and addressing young Canes.
Okay.
About what it means to be a Hurricane and where the chain, the whole deal. There's a video. I'm trying to think of where I have a reference for this because I have a reference for what the meeting room looks like. It looks like a university, study hall. Like it's deep room. And Ed was at the podium in front of these young people giving a Cane speech, and it's Hall of Fame worthy, as I remember seeing a couple of minutes of it. Maybe you can find it on YouTube. Maybe it was an NFL Films thing or some homage to Ed Reed, because we're going to start to see that stuff, right? I mean, we're talking about a guy that let's go back to the beginning of this conversation, Chris Pika and Luke Jones, a guy who would have statues and all of that other stuff if he had been a Tennessee Titan or if he had been another Miami Hurricane who's one of the greatest players to ever play the game in the same era as Ray Lewis. I mean, this is the week Ed Reed has to stand on his own, right?
Yep.
He should. He should.
Yep. And and it's funny. I lived in New Orleans, was with the Saints for 7 years, and I lived in Destrehan. I literally lived like a half a mile from the high school. I mean, you couldn't escape Ed Reed and his legacy.
When I
in that
wrote
area.
his story in Purple Rain 2, the chapter, and I'll share that this week. I wrote an Ed Reed chapter about him. His story about the family that sort of adopted him in and put him on the right pathway and changed. I mean, Ed Reed has this incredible story that I wrote about in Purple Rain 2.
And had some incredible tragedy.
I don't even know how to say that. Destrehan
High School. Yep.
I would have pronounced it wrong.
And he had some incredible tragedy in that part of Louisiana involving his brother.
His brother?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep, down that way and not far from Destrehan, as a matter of fact. Where some of his family still is.
But a favorite son of that community.
No doubt. Everybody, he did a lot there. I think the Ravens went back and honored him there, some with the field or some stuff.
Well, I mean, part of the Purple Rain 2 journey was for him and Jacoby Jones being from that area. Right. And, of course, Chris worked for the Saints and lived in that area for a long period of time. I mean, Ed Reed is one of those, not Archie Manning in New Orleans, but from a kid growing up in a
tough part of Louisiana, yes.
I mean, how many Hall of Famers from that area, from New Orleans? Local, born, Cal Ripken-y kind of Hall of Famers from there.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody else but him. But I'm sure there's. I'm
the Bobby Heberts. There's a bunch of local sons of New Orleans, but he's one of them.
Yep, he's definitely in that group. I mean, as far as local legends, yes, I think the group is very, very small. Let's put it that way.
Am I nuts, LaDainian Tomlinson? Or I'm trying to think other people that are people that came back when the floods happened, local kids, right?
Right. Yeah.
I'm thinking musicians. I'm thinking Fats Domino.
Yeah,
I'm thinking all those people.
Yep.
So that really would mean that Ed Reed's one of the special athletes of New Orleans ever.
Yes.
Well, get him a statue down in
Destrahan. Destrahan.
Spell it.
D-E-S.
Like Strahan.
Yeah. Yep.
Like Michael Strahan.
Yeah, D-E-S-T-R.
That's why I keep going to Strahan.
D-E-S-T-R-E-H-A-N.
But you wouldn't call Michael Strahan Strahan.
That's right.
Strahan.
Yep.
We're on Radio Row. It's just getting started. We're at the Georgia World Congress. It's all brought to you by our friends at Curio Wellness and Health Spa, just south of Timonium Road on York Road. Stop by, see Brian Sanderoff. Some stuff up there online in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. We're going to be here all week. We have a full, no offense, Chris, but the guests are going to get better than you.
God, I hope so.
The morning newspaper's there each and every morning. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. Luke is going to be running around with the Eric DeCosta press conference on Wednesday as well. We're going to be out on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and Snapchat and all those good places as well. We are in Atlanta. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports.